We're going to get started with the second half of our morning set of presentations. Our first speaker after break is Gordon Orians, who's come up from Seattle. Gordon has got his PhD in zoology from the University of California, Berkeley in 1960 and moved to Seattle, where he spent his entire professional career. He was elected to the National Academy of Sciences in 1989 and to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 1990. His most intensive research area has been in behavioral ecology, particularly with blackbirds, which is where I learned about all the great work that he's done. More recently, his research has focused on human emotional responses to environments. This activity was motivated by his general concern with issues of deteriorating environmental quality. And that research has led to a whole suite of other partnerships and cooperation with psychologists, geographers, planners, etc. Today, Gordon will speak about the remarkable North Pacific rainforest. Please help me warmly welcome Gordon Orians. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. It's a pleasure to be here. This is the 5th time I've come to Juneau, and I have yet to see a drop of rain. There's a myth that has to be exploded, and a major research opportunity here, how an environment where it never rains can support such a lush rainforest. And I urge you to begin a research effort in this as quickly as possible. So, why am a behavioral ecologist working on blackbirds appearing before you? Among the hats I wear, I'm on the board of directors of Audubon, Alaska, and have been involved over the last couple of years in the development of research and management activities with respect to the Tongass rainforest. I was involved in the development of a symposium on North Pacific rainforest that was held here in Juneau a couple of years ago. And I hope that you will not spend all of your money on Dominick's book, so that you will save a little bit of it for a book that we are about to produce. It's in press at the University of Washington Press on ecology and management of North Pacific rainforests. Among the authors are a number of the speakers here today, Paul Alaback, Ken Lertzman, and others that were involved in this workshop and the book that we are about to produce. So this is the background that I bring to this talk, and why it is that a blackbird guy is speaking to you. Now, I'm an icehouse guy, and I've worked a lot in the environments that the icehouse conditions have produced, although I have been in tropical rainforests as well. But I want to describe a little bit to you, in icehouse terms, how absolutely remarkable this particular environment in which we happen to be talking today. For many years, I taught biogeography, and one of the main topics that you teach in biogeography is the MacArthur-Wilson theory of island biogeography, which was developed and has had an enormous impact on conservation biology as well as the development of theoretical biology. But it was developed in mind with tropical islands. And of course, the empirical basis of that theory was Ed Wilson's data on ants in the tropical islands in the Pacific. And you look at the whole dynamic of that and you ask, okay, we're now talking here, sitting in an island archipelago of a temperate rainforest with a whole bunch of thousands of islands and island biogeography dynamics. And you just simply can't lay the MacArthur-Wilson theory onto this place because it has a very, very different history. And a whole bunch of new, that's not to downgrade MacArthur-Wilson, which is one of the great inventions of modern biology, but the need to develop new and interesting ideas to deal with the kind of rainforest we're talking about here is extremely important. Not only did this area covered with ice until 10,000 years ago. But as we know, there were also areas that were not ice covered. We have endemic plants and animals that obviously survived the glacial period in this area. And then we've had a very complex recolonization of the area by different groups coming from different places. Some things have arrived by sea. Some have come in through gaps in the rainforest along the river corridors from streams that have their headwaters in the interior. They've come in all different ways, and it's continuing to happen. And we have extremely complicated patterns of biogeographic distributions of plants and animals in this rainforest that are still poorly understood. And as Kirk points out, the history is rather different. Today we have, on the southern islands, we have black bears and wolves. On the northern islands, you have brown bears and no wolves. The fossil record indicates that that wasn't true very long ago. So this dynamic is going on very, very rapidly now, and this is unfolding. And the wonderful research opportunities that exist here, where you have this incredible dynamic interrelationship between the mountains and the sea, where we have watersheds, or rivers whose watersheds are the interior, we have rivers whose watersheds are in glaciers, and we have a whole set of rivers, which includes all of them on the islands, whose watersheds are not in glaciers, and have totally different dynamics. They have totally different relationships to the sea, and they're bringing different nutrients to the sea. The interactions are incredibly complicated, and they're changing because we're going to be watching rivers whose watersheds are now in glaciers become rivers whose watersheds are not in glaciers. And we're going to see how that happens. So the research opportunities in this area are absolutely unbelievable and pretty much untapped. And as Dominick says, the temperate rainforests of the world haven't received very much attention because it's all been in the tropics, but the opportunities to understand the dynamics and colonizations and the development of modern biogeographic patterns, some of the most exciting opportunities exists in the temperate rainforests of the world, and no better place than right here. So we have a whole bunch of opportunities that I want to just briefly describe of what I think this unique place can do for us. One, as Dominick pointed out, we still have pretty much the complete biota here. This region contains all of the apex predators. We recently lost the caribou on Haida Gwaii, but they would have gone with the climate change anyway, so that, and some other things are going to go as it warms and other things are coming in, but you have pretty much the complete biota that existed here. And there are still large numbers of undisturbed watersheds of all sizes that have had no logging, have no roads in them. And we understand a lot about the importance of watersheds of different sizes. There are opportunities to think about them here and to know what we might want to do with them. This is an area that is undergoing enormous economic transition. The economy of the area over the last 100 years or so was built on subsidized extraction of timber at unsustainable rates for export to global markets. And the whole global market in forestry has changed dramatically. There's now a glut of timber on the market, a lot of it coming from the southern hemisphere, where the Pinaceae now has been transported in vast numbers, and we're getting the Pinaceae being exported back to the northern hemisphere and causing a glut on the timber market. So the future economy based on subsidized extraction of timber resources for export no longer exists. It will not come back. And the likelihood that under the kind of fiscal constraints that the country operates now, that the federal government will be willing to continue to engage in subsidized extraction of resources in places like this does not look terribly promising. And so that I think the area it will be forced to undergo an important economic transition. It's already undergoing, obviously, because the big Ketchikan pulp mill no longer is working. So that the opportunity exists now to think in a variety of new ways to develop the economic base of this region based on the environmental resources, but in ways that serve both human needs, but also are involved and will enable us to preserve the rich biological diversity of this area. And of course, there's still an enormous amount to learn about the biological diversity and the biogeographic patterns of this area. We know a great deal about the plants. We know a great deal about the amphibians and birds and mammals. And then as Kirk would say, the lights go out on what we know. We know We know that there's this enormous lichen biodiversity. We don't know how it's distributed. A tremendous amount of the biodiversity of this region is in the soil, and we don't know the distribution patterns of soil organisms. Virtually nothing has been done. And almost certainly there are going to be enormous surprises here as to how those communities are assembled. And so there is a major research agenda which involves a whole bunch of things that could be based in this area and will not only tell us a lot about this area and how it had formed, but will inform our overall understanding of island biogeography and the development of ecological patterns over time. But also, there's some other opportunities that come as a result of the economic drivers that are now changing things. There's a market, not a big market, but an available market for the unusual quality of the timber of old-growth Sitka spruce in this area, which has very, very small growth rings because it's a cold climate and it produces an interesting wood. And a way to relate this globally is that we all know that the best violins and violas ever made were the Stradivarius and his co-workers in Italy at a particular time. Now, it's impossible to believe that nobody else knew how to make violins as well as Stradivarius did. So what was the trick that Stradivarius had? Well, we happen to know where he got his conifers for the violins, and we know the dates, and it happened to be the time of the Little Ice Age in Europe. And almost certainly, a part of the quality of those instruments relates to the fact that the trees that he was harvesting and from which he made his violins were growing very, very slowly, had very, very narrow growth rings. So there's a niche market here. And right now you're exporting logs for guitars, special export here for guitars. So looking at what are the ways in which some sustainable logging, carefully done of the resources here for niche markets that don't depend upon subsidized export of raw logs elsewhere in the world, which simply isn't going to be possible anyway. So, but what are the opportunities there? Also, there's no reason that I can see why the people in Southeast Alaska should be importing wood for local construction from anywhere else. Looking at what are the ways to integrate that into a new economic system that provides income, and the degree to which any timber harvesting that is happening, to what degree can you add value added in the local products? I mean, the past it's been shipping raw logs out, and the Japanese are very smart. They said, we don't like the sizes you want to give them, just send us the raw logs, and they outsmarted us, and so that no value added was given to the products here. That shouldn't be allowed to continue. There are opportunities. How can you build a local industry that is value added? The products of these forests that can be done on a sustainable basis and in ways that still preserve the biological resources of the area. I think the opportunities there are very, very interesting. We also are building and have great opportunities for ecotourism in this region. And building more upon things that produce more income for the local regions than the great floating hotel ships that come through, where most of the income and the profits go somewhere else and not to the local region. It brings a lot of people in, and you get to the boutique shops in Juneau. I've been in Juneau when there were 3 or 4 hotel ships lined up here and people walking around and buying stuff in the boutique shops. But that isn't really the kind of ecotourism income that the region really needs, and I think is possible with very careful planning and thinking about how you can build on these resources to encourage, in addition to the commercial and to the recreational fisheries that go on here that bring a lot of people for high value stuff, that you can also bring people for ecotourism for a bunch of other reasons. And some of the biogeographic patterns and the unusual ability to watch wolves fishing and things of that sort that you can't see anywhere else offer opportunities for development that use the economic value of the local resources here in new and different ways. Also, this region offer some interesting opportunities for international cooperation. The boundary between, it's interesting, I look at the maps of this region, and those that are produced by Alaska, British Columbia doesn't exist. There's this line, and then there's the rest of it's blank. And then I look at the maps created by British Columbia, and Alaska doesn't exist. And of course, the boundary is not a watershed boundary. It's a historical boundary based on what the Russians managed to settle in and what we managed to buy from them. And so the interchange that's going on is very interesting, and the first thing we ought to do is make the maps right. That nobody should be allowed to publish a map of Alaska that doesn't show British Columbia, and vice versa. And so we think about what's really going on there, and then to ask, okay, we've got a bunch of rivers that are coming through that, and they got big watersheds, and they're discharging totally different things into the local environment than the rivers whose watersheds are entirely in the Alaskan part of the environment. And as we also know, they have been major corridors for biogeographic expansion. Things coming in and out are using those river corridors as ways of coming in. That's apparently how moose got in to the area, coming in that way. And a number of the birds that are colonizing as it's warming up, and amphibians that are colonizing this region, have come through those corridors from the interior. So the management of this rainforest region will require greater cooperation between the United States and Canada. And there are opportunities, since we are two nations divided by a common language and of a common mother, that we ought to be able to figure out some ways and to develop better international cooperation and utilize our common knowledge of these regions to see how we can co-manage the economic development and the use of the resources of the region that integrate in a much better way the United States and Canada in an area that the ecosystems don't know about that boundary. And we keep fostering it and not thinking about it, but from just a simple way we produce our maps. And it's absolutely stunning. You look at the maps. There's some interesting educational opportunities that this region offers that can, I think, help build a clientele and an understanding of its dynamics that can help us preserve it in the long run. We have the rich native Alaskan and native Canadian cultures on the coast that have produced some of the world's most outstanding art and some of the most outstanding use of different resources provided by the trees and the salmon. This is world-class stuff that can be the source of very important ecotourism, and also understanding of the historical ways in which people have used the resources of an area, and how, as things change economically, as different cultures come and mix together, the way in which the resources are used change, how cultures adapt, and how they move forward and take advantage of new opportunities that have come while still retaining the important elements of their original cultures. And there's incredible opportunities here for building more educational opportunities at the University of Southeast Alaska, bringing people in as sort of eco-historical cultural tourists who want to learn more about these things and want to have an opportunity to learn of the history and the interesting way in which people have come down through this area, used it, and modified how they have used the areas in the past. One of the most important areas in modern ecology is restoration ecology, the big R word. And one of the bits of good news is that ecosystems do recover. We don't have to accept a degraded state once we've knocked things down, if we haven't lost the elements that were there and are able to stop some of the pressures we've been causing. Ecosystems have an immense capacity to rebuild. one of the major projects I'm involved with now is a prairie restoration project in northeast Montana that's jointly done by World Wildlife Fund and the American Prairie Foundation. And an area that lost its bison, it lost its wolves, it lost its bears. This was an area when Lewis and Clark came through that they saw the largest numbers of large mammals. This areas where Lewis was chased into the river by a grizzly bear, et cetera. This is a fantastic area. It had lost all of those elements and had been converted to a wheat and cattle culture, again sustained economically by subsidies from the federal government. Otherwise it would have collapsed. So it was not economically viable. The area is depopulating. The area in which I'm working has half the number of people it had 40 years ago. And the economic future has to be done on something different. We have now brought the bison back. The cougars have come back. The wolves keep coming and they get shot, but when we get a bit more of them, they'll be there. And you can restore this, and there can be an ecotourism opportunity for Americans to see what the American Serengeti used to be like. And that's going to be, I think, a wonderful thing that will happen. So restoration possibilities are enormous, and watersheds that have been harvested, and particularly you saw some of the southern islands, Prince of Wales Island in particular, where the harvesting is particularly heavy. We have opportunities to identify those watersheds that have the highest ecological and natural resource values, to figure out how to help them recover and perhaps even accelerate the succession back to more mature forest and some of the values they provide. There's opportunities to do that here in Southeast Alaska. And we can work with the natural ecosystem processes to bring that about. So here we have this, what is an incredibly, I hesitate to use the word unique because I mean, we overuse it all the time. Every place is unique, okay? My backyard is unique. There's no other place like it. If you don't believe me, come see. If I'm wrong, you get a free beer, okay? It is unusual, okay? And some of the major things that are driving this, the closest things comes to the Chilean forest that Paul Alaback will be describing to you, but there's a number of the elements here in the complexities of the biogeography that are here that are just not duplicated anywhere else. And so the opportunities that this place provides to understand, develop our better understanding of both basic science, ecology, evolution, biogeography, these fundamental environmental sciences that inform our understanding of how we interact with the world, and if we're going to be sustainable with it, what we need to know about how it works. There are some things to learn about this place that we don't know, and they're going to be extremely valuable. But then there are also these wonderful ways to use that knowledge integrated with what we do socioculturally to provide a resource base that enriches human life here, allows a sustainable relationship that's rich and rewarding, that can be a base for other people coming in. As President Thomas says, you would welcome other people coming in to learn about your resources and to participate in them and provide some support for the local economy, because this is a place that, properly done and properly managed, a lot of people will want to come and see. And it may even be, you know, that given that with the recession and it gets more and more expensive to travel all around the globe, that wealthy North Americans will be happy to spend their vacation dollars closer to home in an area that won't be quite so expensive to get to, and will have unusual properties that they're not going to see anywhere else. So in sum, I think the opportunities that are present here to develop a new way of integrating resource use, human societies, preservation of biodiversity, they're really incredibly rich because so much is still left. We're going to need to do some of the restoration, but there's an awful lot of places we don't have to restore. We just have to remember and find out where they are, where those unique values are, and just decide we're going to set them aside for those purposes, and we won't have to do any work. And some other areas where there's not very much work, and let nature do it. And so the opportunities here to develop a vibrant, rich economy that we will watch as the climate warms and all sorts of new organisms come in, and they're going to be coming, and they're going to be coming fast. My favorite bird, the red-winged blackbird, which I've got a 3-hour talk that I hope you'll ask me to give about them, is spreading north. It's showing up around Juneau more often. It's showing up around Anchorage now. Though you're going to be enriched by red-winged blackbirds, and you won't believe how wonderful this is. So things are going to happen. It's going to be wonderful to unfold. I hope to live long enough to see some of it unfold, but I know a lot of you will live longer than I, and I wish you the best as you watch it develop. Thank you. I'm told that we have 5 minutes, and I stopped before he put the 5-minute card up. I hope you noticed that. I'll be happy to respond to any questions. I can't have been that clear.
Yes, hi. Thanks for most interesting talk. I would like to know what controls the northern distribution of red-winged blackbirds.
It's basically marsh productivity, which rises with temperature. But see, I'm an Ice Age guy, and these marshes and the grasslands and stuff like that that support them, that's Ice Age stuff. And I happen to love it. I mean, I don't know why people want to go back to that 75 million year stuff ago, but anyway, it's. But you'll enjoy red-winged blackbirds. They're really real lovely birds.
Yeah. I'm from Anchorage, so I'm too looking forward to those showing up there soon. But my question is about the issues associated with what are generally called invasive species, and that is these much larger kinds of connections, and how you view their potential impacts and the kinds of attention that should be paid to that phenomena.
Well, of course, every organism here is in Southeast Alaska. Almost everyone is an invasive species. Okay, we have an endemic pine marten that's obviously survived on the coastal areas, and we got a few endemic plants that were nunatacs that were not glaciated, but otherwise everything else is an invasive species. And all of the biotas of almost every place in the world, if we go back in time a little bit, it's just a matter of the temporal frame of reference, they're all invasives. As Kirk vividly demonstrated all of us, things have been moving all over the place. Nobody is where it was X million years ago, and probably nobody is where it's going to be X million years from now. So the whole question of invasives is very, very complex. Some of the reasons that it's tremendously important for us and to be worried about it is the matter of the time frame. How fast is it occurring? How much are we moving around? It's very likely that the historians of the future will refer to this particular period in history as the Homogocene, where we homogenize the world's biota, and that the courses in biogeography that I used to teach and that people might continue to teach for a while may no longer be necessary, because there isn't any interesting biogeography to report anymore. Everything's so smudged up that the field is canceled for lack of interest and a lack of subject matter anymore. One of the things that is going on in conservation biology, and one of the issues is how to predict which of the species that might come in, that might come inadvertently or we might deliberately introduce, are likely to produce problems that we don't want. And we've got a few examples. The best predictor of whether a plant is going to become seriously invasive is whether it was invasive back in where it comes from. That's the best predictor we have so far. We also know that you can predict pretty much where an invasive thing is going to establish itself by knowing the climate envelope of the places where it comes from. And this turns out to be the best possible predictor we know of where it's going to succeed when it's brought in. You can predict, for example, where pheasants have survived and become an important game bird in the United States and Canada from simply climatic factors. So we've got something like that. We also know that the record of importing mammals to solve problems has been catastrophically bad. So don't try to solve a problem by bringing a mammal. And it turns out that amphibians aren't so hot either. The cane toad, this marvelous toad of Central America, which is a great thing to watch, was brought into the sugarcane fields in Australia to eat this cane weevil, but it doesn't happen to like eating cane weevils, hasn't eaten them at all, and is gobbling up the native frogs, and it's highly toxic, and the native predators haven't learned how to deal with it, so they munch on a cane toad and get poisoned, et cetera. So we know that there's a whole bunch of introductions you shouldn't do, but I think the way to think about it in Southeast Alaska here is to be watching and seeing how it's going to, because a lot of new stuff is going to come in. I mean, the climate is warming really fast here, and there's going to be a lot of species that are not here now that will come in the lifetimes of many of you. I won't be around to see most of it, but they'll be coming. And to try to monitor who's coming, rather than getting alarmed about it, I mean, treat it again as a research subject of tremendous interest. How are they coming? And to avoid, I think a policy I would recommend is avoiding deliberately introducing stuff here. I mean, just let things happen and watch it, and if things are getting out of control and getting what you don't want, maybe you want to intervene, but at least let nature take its course, but don't try to assist it too much.
Thank you, Gordon. We get to hear from Gordon again tomorrow morning during a beautiful morning keynote that he's going to share with Elaine Abraham. Our next speaker is Dr. Paul Alaback. Paul is a forest ecologist and botanist with a PhD from Oregon State University. He's been doing research on temperate rainforests for over 30 years with a focus on disturbance ecology and conservation. He was a scientist with the Pacific Northwest Research Station of the Forest Service here in Juneau for 8 years, and has been a professor of ecology at the University of Montana for almost 20. And as you may guess, Paul is here to talk about the coastal rainforests of South America. Please warmly welcome Paul Alaback.
Well, it's always wonderful to come back to Southeast Alaska. It's a special place. I've been really fascinated with these places for a long time, and it's been fun to learn new things about them all the time. Just as Gordon was saying, it's a wonderful, wonderful opportunity. Well, today I would like to talk about these forests down south. We've sort of alluded to them a little bit, and I think that's really kind of exciting. When I spent a lot of time trying to figure out the forests here in Southeast Alaska, and at a certain point I realized, you know, I was thinking of the saying that's usually attributed to Bertrand Russell, and that's the idea that you can't actually really understand a system or actually understand a place unless you go outside of that place and have some point of reference. You can't know how unique something is unless you have something to compare it to. And that was kind of my prime motivation starting in 1989. I started exploring all these different ecosystems down in Patagonia and in Chile and Argentina, trying to see what I can learn from those, with the main objective having a broader, deeper understanding of what a temperate rainforest really is. And these ideas I always heard we were talking about here in the Tongass, do they actually apply to other places? Well, first of all, how many of you have gone to Patagonia? How many have taken a trip down to Chile or Argentina? Well, that's cool, a number of you. I know Mary Wilson and her colleagues here in Juneau have done some really wonderful work down there. So some people have worked down there, but it's a wonderful place. But for most people, Patagonia is this picture. It's one national park, one view of a national park. That's the most common picture you see in travel posters and magazines and movies. And it's not very representative of Patagonia. It's actually barely a rainforest. It's the very edge of it. It's a steppe grassland with these cute animals, but it really isn't a particularly good place to compare with where we are right here. But look at this. That kind of looks like Southeast Alaska, doesn't it? This is a fjord just south of Puerto Montt, and it is really remarkable. And of course, I'm not the first person to notice this. I mean, naturalists going back to Darwin and others, notice this remarkable similarity of this coastline in southern South America with what you see in Norway and what you see in southeast Alaska. So there's a couple big parallels between these regions that make it a really fascinating comparison. The obvious one is the geology and the geography. It's a fjordland landscape. You've got Pacific plate subduction, some very rapid uplift rates, and fjord landscapes. This photo is from here, and then there's a photo from Patagonia. So very, very similar looking glaciers and icebergs and physical environment, which is so important in providing a template for living organisms, especially for us. And the other thing is, Mike mentioned, I've been sort of focused on disturbance most of my life. It can be a good thing. In the old days, we thought disturbance was a really bad thing, and after a while, we realized, well, everything gets disturbed. It's just how it's disturbed is what matters. And there is a real parallel here, that most forests get burned up all the time. I spent a lot of time in Montana seeing a lot of that. But in temperate rainforests, that's much less of a factor. There can be fire, but it's much less frequent, and it's not a key factor in explaining the plants and animals that occur there. And so in the coast of Chile, as well as here in southeast Alaska, the frequency, intensity, and pattern that comes from wind throw is extremely important. So that's a parallel influence in both environments, making a good comparison. And our anthropogenic disturbance, we're not very creative. We tend to do the same thing in every place on Earth. And so there's a lot of clear-cut logging going on. But the other thing I'd have to point out that's very important in Chile compared to here is there's a lot of forest degradation. We might call it selective logging, but there's been a lot of individual tree logging taking out the most economically valuable species. So when Dominick was giving these figures of deforestation, that was like an optimistic picture because it's not including a lot of the degradation that's occurred in a lot of these forests for a number of social and economic reasons. Well, what does the forest look like? Well, the big contrast, as we've been introduced to earlier this morning, is you've actually got broadleaf evergreen trees, not conifers in these forests. That's a big difference. And I'm used to broadleaves. I grew up in Illinois. I know about the deciduous forests, and they don't look like those trees. They're tall. They've got dense canopies. They've got very thick, small leaves. And so anthropomorphically, when I first went down there, it's sort of like a broadleaf tree is trying to become a conifer. It's getting tough, small enough leaves that it's beginning to look a little more like a conifer. And it's kind of tall, not open and branchy like you see a typical oak tree out in the Great Plains or something. And then you go to this place, the Valdivian rainforest. This is kind of the height of rainforest development on the South American coast, the perfect combination of temperature and rainfall and history. And, from a northern hemisphere perspective, we'd say, well, that doesn't look like a temperate rainforest. I mean, that looks like the tropics. I mean, we've got ferns that are 6 feet tall. We've got all these glossy-leaved evergreen things that we see in Georgia or South America. This is just incredible, but it is a temperate rainforest. It does have snow in the wintertime. It has a very similar environment. So this is what I think was so exciting about going down here. For many biologists have had that same experience, that it really expands your notion of what's possible when you go to these different places. What's possible with this kind of rainforest climate. Okay, so why use this comparative approach, comparative ecology? Well, there's a number of questions you can answer by doing detailed comparisons like that. They're really impossible to study otherwise. If you're comparing areas, you're totally isolated with one another with completely different histories and different cultural influences, you begin to study the influence of those factors. We can't talk about differences in history here because there aren't any. It's a very common story to the evolution of the forest on this coast. You need to go someplace else to see what other possibilities happen with history and cultural interactions. And it allows us to have much more robust ideas about temperate rainforests. We're mostly here in the Tongass, and we've got all kinds of wonderful stories of what a temperate rainforest is based in the Tongass. So the real test is how well do our ideas apply to other places that share what we think are these important factors of rainfall and temperature. It's a great place to really have a rigorous scientific test of what's the cause-effect relationship here. And certainly not the least important aspect is it's a wonderful means of promoting collaboration. If we, the people that are studying these temperate rainforests that share these characteristics can start collaborating and interchanging ideas, I think we have a lot to learn from that. Get people from really different perspectives, really different cultures, asking these same kind of questions. I think there's tremendous benefit for everybody involved. Okay, well, the questions that sort of motivated my original exploring the Patagonia coast were really looking at these general patterns. One is across similar climatic gradients, going from, say, the Redwoods to Kenai Peninsula, do you see a similar pattern across the Patagonia coastline as you go down that coast? It's sort of somewhat of a way of looking at climate change, looking at how you change the climate a little bit, how does the forest change? And how have cultural and economic differences in these areas affected conservation issues and how people approach conservation? Do we have the same issues? Is the same impact? Just to get a broader sense of thinking about rainforests in general. And this question actually ends up being pretty easy to answer. You'd say, well, why South America? I mean, it's really cool. Patagonia has this cachet to it, and it's a really interesting place, nice people. But actually, we have some good biological reasons. It's really the only place in the southern hemisphere that shares that broad climatic range of conditions that we see here in the Pacific coastal area. And it is the second largest region of temperate rainforest, too, so it's natural. And it has all these parallels. It's got similarities in geology, like I explained before, similarities in the timing of glacial advances and retreats. The little ice age we talk about here, that was also a very important factor in South America. We have big glacial ice sheets with some strong parallels too. The El Nino phenomenon that's so important here is equally important in South America. And so those things are similar, but then of course there's a huge contrast in terms of the history of the area and the economy and cultural influences. So it's really a wonderful place to get at those kind of factors. And this is my first attempt at a global map. Dominick shows the latest high-tech version, but this is what we did scouring the literature about 20 years ago, trying to figure out where temperate rainforests were, and these two areas emerged. Now, another thing I'd like to point out here, what's confused a lot of people, is they'll say, well, we're at 57 degrees north, so let's go to 57 degrees south and see how different it is. And that sounds logical, but that assumes there's no other factors that influence climate other than latitude. And it turns out that actually our rainforests, mostly the perhumid and the wet forests we're talking about here, are pretty much from 50 degrees north to 60 degrees north. That's where most of it is. In South America, the heart of the rainforest is actually only at 37 degrees south to about 50 degrees south. So it's shifted by almost 10 degrees of latitude. But the big difference you notice here is in South America, it's almost like an oceanic island. It's completely surrounded by ocean. There's very little land mass, whereas in North America, there's a huge land mass, so actually it gets cold really fast as you go south in latitude in South America. So actually, in terms of summer temperatures and precipitation distribution, things like that, these are matched very well, even though they're at different latitudes. There's three basic kinds of rainforests that I found it's useful to talk about, of temperate rainforests, based on distribution of rainfall. Just like in the tropical forest, distribution is so important. There's a seasonal rainforest, which you see in Oregon, Washington, places like that where most of the rainfall occurs in the wintertime. There's the perhumid rainforest, like right here, where it stays wet throughout the year. It's a little bit cooler. And then there's the subpolar or subantarctic or boreal rainforest. They have a lot of different names, where it's much cooler yet. You have more persistent snow and very cool, rainy summers. And those three kinds of rainforests occur in Patagonia in different abundance. These are three provinces of Chile. They talk about regions, the 10th, 11th, and the 12th region. The 12th region is the Magallanes region at the very southern tip, and so it's a much larger extent of subpolar rainforest than we have ours up here, up in Prince William Sound. So we have a lot more of that in Chile, very, very windy and wet down there, and a very, very narrow area of seasonal. So some difference in the types, but the full range of types occurs in both places, making a nice place to study. So then I started looking at the climate data, and it turns out that in general, especially with all that ocean, it's no surprise that the winters are a little milder in the temperate rainforest southeast of southern South America than here. And if you actually go to the central coast of Washington along Long Beach or Aberdeen, if you know that area, that is a pretty good match for the temperatures that you see in southern Chile. And the summer temperatures are similar actually to southeast Alaska, but southeast Alaska has colder winters. So it's close enough that we can make a pretty reasonable comparison. If you look at the number of species of trees per degree latitude, there's a similar pattern. The ice sheets create some funny pinch-off points here, but basically a similar pattern. You lose species as you go north. And notice there's a lot more species in South America when you're at the warmest latitude. So if you're at the latitudes of the redwoods, you have a lot more species in South America. But as soon as it cools off, you get to an area like this, it's a similar number of species. And then you see some parallels in these different ecosystems in both the wet and the dry parts of South America. You have grassland types with actually the same genus of grass, which I think is kind of interesting. Then you have the equivalent of like ponderosa pine and things like that. Nothofagus dambeyi, we talked about the southern beech forests a little bit earlier this morning. They are an incredibly important group of trees in the southern hemisphere. They're really key to the rainforests. One species in particular is essentially like coastal Douglas fir, very similar disturbance ecology, very broadly distributed. There's another species that's equivalent to subalpine fir, and then the myrtle laurel forests are the closest parallel to our hemlock cedar forest. So there are some similarities, but species completely unrelated, different families, just kind of amazing. So are there some analogs? Are there some species that look kind of the same, but they have completely different histories? A classic example, convergent evolution. My favorite one is this one. Of course, Devil's Club needs no introduction to anybody who's been outside. And what blew me away when I was first down to Chile is I ran into this thing. It has a leaf shape, looks exactly like a devil's club. It has spines below the leaves, just like a devil's club. It's actually bigger than a devil's club. It's sometimes twice as big as a devil's club, and occurs along gravelly river corridors. So it's pretty cool. It's in a different family. It's in the water milfoil family. It's called genera. And so that's kind of a cool thing. I guess it's important to be really spiny if you grow on the edges of these streams so people don't grab onto you. Maybe they figured it out in both hemispheres. The other thing is a cedar family is quite ancient, at least from my perspective. And so the cedars were broadly distributed in both poles. So we actually have cedars that are very similar, both north and south. That's one of the groups that is quite similar. This is the western red cedar, one of the bigger ones, used to grow in Washington. And this is Fitzroya or Alerce, which is a legendary, iconic tree in South America. One of my first trips down there, our object was to try to document the oldest and most intact examples of these wonderful trees. This forest, actually, the dominant trees are in the range of 2,000 to 3,000 years old. So they're quite a bit older than our other conifer forests. So quite a wonderful forest, very similar. One of the big questions is, I think this is what confused some biogeographers when I was trying to get information on this. They'd always say the broadleaf forests are like this, and the needle-leaf forests are like this, and the twain shall never meet. They've missed the fact they're both temperate rainforests. And so this is kind of the question. Why broadleaf trees down there? Is it really a temperate rainforest with these broadleaf trees? And there's a couple hypotheses, and I think the one makes the most sense to me is it's just simply a case of geographical isolation. You're essentially in an island. South America is so incredibly isolated, and those Nothofagus trees coming from Antarctica were able to evolve in all these niches that were played by conifers up here. They just weren't conifers around to evolve into these niches. So really quite interesting. But it's true, there's milder winters, there's less severe droughts, the more equitable rainfall. So that might be other secondary factors. But it just gets you thinking that there's a lot of possibilities out there. These forests could look really differently if we started out from a different place. So what are some of the differences? If they're all the same, we don't learn very much. What are the differences? Well, you probably heard about the roaring 40s in Patagonia. What the roaring 40s means is the 40-degree latitudes, and the winds start across the ocean from Australia and New Zealand. There's nothing before they hit the Chilean coast, and so unbelievable gale force winds. That's why Patagonia is supposed to be such an adventure, trying to climb mountains around there. It's so unbelievably windy. So it stands to reason the trees are a little shorter. It's fairly adaptive to that condition. And there's a little bit less biomass in general. They are shorter trees. And a little bit less productivity, implying some of the soils are not quite as fertile as some of the areas up here. They're very structurally complex, many, many canopy layers, very open, brushy kind of forests are very common there, and very complex species interactions. Lots of, Mary Wilson and her colleagues have studied that here, these mutualisms, where you have different plants and animals involved, the seed dispersal and pollination, very complex interactions like that, which is a really key thing to be thinking about here. And completely different organisms, often different families, even for trees. So completely different organisms, which makes it a great comparison. If these are real universal truths we're working in about how rainforests work, then this is a good test to see that happens. So again, from admittedly a northern hemisphere perspective, we would look down there and say, you have species that are missing. How could that be? And these species are all keystone species, actually. They're species that play an incredible role in the dynamics and the structured functioning of ecosystems. A very significant thing is there is no alder family in the southern hemisphere. So there are no trees that efficiently fix atmospheric nitrogen and build soils after disturbance. So this has huge consequence. There's no equivalent to migratory salmon. You don't have a major nutrient export coming in with salmon. So that's a very big difference. Of course, they've introduced them, but we'll just start with the native here. And the other thing that's very interesting, we had some students working on that. The cottonwood family is missing. And so there are no plants that play that role in floodplains and river systems. So that has important implications of the geomorphology of their stream systems and how they recover from flooding. So it's really quite interesting. Really changes the dynamics. A very dense forest, the riparian, mostly formed by myrtles, but nothing like our cottonwood. And here's an example of the implications of things like this. We've dated a lot of the moraines and looked at post-glacial succession, just like we've done up in Glacier Bay and places like that. It takes 3 to 5 times longer for forests to come in following deglaciation. So clearly part of that is the lack of these big nitrogen fixers that we have in the form of Sitka alder here. So it just kind of lets you realize that when we talk species coming and going, we can be sort of the cavalier about that, but sometimes species really matter. And when you lose some of them, it really changes the dynamics of the system. And you see some very important examples of that here. And we had this wonderful introduction of this topic by Kirk. That was so nice to see it in that broader perspective. And it's, I think, key to understanding the differences between the Patagonia forests and those up here. We have a completely different history that explains these species. We have a lot of species from Gondwana land that we talked about. They actually evolved in Antarctica and moved up into South America a long time ago. We have some species in the tropics that have adapted to the cool environment in Patagonia that live there. A lot of endemics. Over 90% of the vascular plant species only occur in this rainforest region. So it's a spectacular degree of endemism compared to what we see here in Alaska. And we have some species that actually disperse in North America, mostly the alpine species, and some in the shorelines too. Some evidence that the birds brought some of those down, which I think is kind of fascinating. So I just want to give some pictures to kind of visualize what we're seeing here. I think it's just sort of fascinating seeing these plants. I'm working on a field guide for this area, and it's been really fun looking at all these things. Well, this is what Coigüe, or Nothofagus dombei looks like. This is the Douglas fir of the Andes. Occurs in a broad array of habitats, very thick evergreen leaves, very small leaves on it, and this fungus that actually forms these really neat structures there that the native tribes used from the mushrooms that emerge. It's pretty interesting. This is Lenga, which is a deciduous Nothofagus tree. So it's sort of equivalent to subalpine fir, but since it's a broadleaf tree, it has these big branches on it, so it's very susceptible to snow breakage. So it doesn't occur as high up the mountains as subalpine fir can. So there's a basic physical architectural difference that influences timberline. They've got a number of students working in that right now. It's really quite fascinating. And this is Nothofagus antarctica, and this plays a role, I would say, somewhat similar to mountain hemlock. It occurs up near timberline, occurs in swampy places, marginal areas. And so tremendous diversity in this one genus of trees. And of course, the legendary one is the monkey puzzle. You can just imagine the dinosaurs cruising along under these trees. They're so incredibly ancient. The Araucaria family is quite wonderful. It's too bad we don't have it up here. And we mentioned the podocarp family. The other thing that's interesting to mention about these is the conifers in the southern hemisphere, in Chile in particular, mostly have male trees and female trees, which you see a lot in the neotropics. So that's another very fascinating contrast with here, where virtually all of our trees have both male and female on the same tree. And this is called the grape of the Andes. This is what the fruit looks like. It's pretty wild. The other thing about podocarps is interesting. If you're walking through the forest, it sort of reminds you of hemlock. The needles are about the size of hemlock. So when I first saw it, I said, gee, it sort of looks like hemlock, but no, not at all. And there's a few neotropical remnants that occur down there, quite fascinating. This one, I think, is one of my favorites. And just guess what family this might be. This is called Palo Santo. It has little spines on it. Nice tree. It gets up to 30, 40 feet in height. This is a member of the sunflower family. This is one of the most primitive members of the sunflower family. A lot of evidence suggests the sunflower family actually arose in South America. So it sort of blows your mind of what the possibilities are down there. It's pretty cool. This is an interesting one. There's many families of parasitic plants. Here we have one main family, the mistletoes. You have many others there. And this one has a particularly cool story. This plant flowers in the wintertime. And there's a nocturnal marsupial mammal that eats the seeds. And then when it defecates on the little branches it's walking on, that's a perfect way for this parasitic plant to find new hosts. So it's a very tight mutualism that you see in the neotropics as well as all the way down in Patagonia. So it's a really fast, and that's an example of these really interesting interactions you see with the species down there. And of course, there's lots of things endemic. One thing I think you'd mention is sort of another funny example how we sometimes misinterpret everything and names are misleading. This is a very popular plant in florist shops. You've probably seen it when you bought a bouquet, and it's usually called a Peruvian lily. It's not Peruvian, it's not a lily, and it's actually native to Patagonia, and this actually forms the understory in these lenga forests. It's quite a spectacular plant. But it's in its own family, and this is what's typical. I'm sort of used to here, you know a few plant families, and you sort of know what's going on. That doesn't really work down there. There's lots and lots of families with just a few species in each family. So it's very, very different floristics. And then there's a few species that made it all the way down, and this is one of my favorite examples. Of course, we have the crowberry in our peat bogs and muskegs, and it has blackberries. That's why it's called a crowberry. And down there are red berries. And otherwise, they look exactly the same and grow in exactly the same habitats. And we see a number of alpine wetland species that do that. Well, another big question then is, well, how does the functioning of these forests compare in these two regions? We want to get at this dynamics, this change that's going to occur with these different kinds of climate changes. Before we get to the greenhouse, in the transition, a little bit. And some really interesting work has been done there. An important factor is if you start looking at the genetics of a lot of these dominant trees there, they don't have much genetic variation. It's a very narrow range of genetic variation, which makes them very difficult for these species to adapt to very rapid change. And the Lertzman is an example that's been studied intensively. What they found out in looking at the genetics is there was not, during the glaciation, many, many more species were lost in Patagonia than in this coastline, which kind of gives you a clue of the sensitivity of that region to climatic changes. What happened with the Lertzman, there were no major refuges for Lertzman to the north in the warmer climates. There were just a few isolated refuges within the Patagonia region, and so you see now some subspecies of Lertzman there. So it was hugely reduced in abundance during the Pleistocene period, and we see that for a lot of other species. So that's one thing that really concerns us a lot, is that with climate change, they have small distributions of species and very complex patterns in mountains, so they're very, very susceptible to environmental change. And then, of course, on top of that, fragmentation is a huge issue in Chile. You have temperate rainforests along the Andes, and then you have temperate rainforests along the coast. Well, it used to be continuous. And the central depression, as that area between those areas there, was ideal for agriculture. And so it's been deforested for hundreds of years. And so it's isolated those two major blocks of rainforest. And the coastal rainforest, a lot of that has been converted to pine plantations. And that's actually the most biodiverse and some of the most biologically rich areas where there's a lot of work right now. And that's what usually happens. We protected the glaciers really well and the tundra. But in terms of the really biologically rich forests, there's just a few reserves around. And this is kind of the flagship of that special place. It's called Ulma. Has these really cool flowers. And this occurs right in the coastal margin near Valdivia. A lot of concern for this very, very rich forest. So what are the implications of climate change down there? Well, I've sort of alluded to a lot of this before, but with a very small change in the distribution of rainfall and amounts of rainfall, we could easily lose a lot of the rainforests, certainly most of the rainforests in Argentina and other places. So it's very sensitive to the distribution of rainfall in particular. The low genetic diversity creates some big problems for adaptation, I think. And of course, fragmentation is a huge problem just because of the pattern of human development in the area. And we just talked a little bit about invasive species, but because it's been isolated for so long, it's particularly sensitive to interactions of species from other areas. We have a lot of people working on that right now. Another thing I really like to emphasize, I think it's really exciting that's happening in Chile right now, is we have a long-term ecological research network in North America, and it's mostly biased towards high-latitude ecosystems. We've got a few in the tropics, and we have one in Antarctica. And so we sort of missed the entire southern hemisphere temperate rainforest biome. So they are developing a long-term ecological research network there, but they're doing it in a different way, which I think is really fascinating. They're calling it a long-term social ecological research network. So they are doing cultural and ethical studies of people and the interactions with the land there, as well as doing the biophysical research. Ricardo Rossi is doing this work, and I really think it would be really good for people to go down and see what they're doing and use some of those examples. So I guess my main thing I can think of that I think is important about this is, first, I just encourage everybody to go down there. If you're doing work in the Tongass, you have tremendous opportunities to broaden your horizons by trying to learn about the other rainforests down there. It really challenges your thinking about things. It's a good way to look at that role of history we've been talking about this morning. And that area is more sensitive to I think is very sensitive to these environmental changes. So again, reaffirms that we're on the largest rainforest here, the most intact rainforest, and the one that's most likely to persist with these environmental changes. And just a fantastic opportunity for collaboration and outreach. I really hope to get more of the Chilean scientists up here in the future. Thank you.
We want to thank Paul for that great talk. He didn't mention his work with citizen science initiatives, and so I encourage you over the next couple of days, if you're interested in citizen science, you also get with Paul and see some of the wonderful work that he's doing in that field as well. So thank you. Our last speaker for the morning is Dr. Ken Lertzman, who's a professor in the School of Resource and Environmental Management at Simon Fraser University, where he's director of the HACI Network for Coastal People, Ecosystems, and Management. And they have the honor of being our newest partner in our partner network, and we have the honor of being their newest partner in their partner network. Ken's research is focused on how natural disturbance regimes and management interact to produce patterns and dynamics in forest stands and landscapes. And much of that work, at least over the last couple of years, that we've been involved in together has to do with cross-boundary data integration, a collaborative project with some of you out here, Dave Demore, Paul Hennon, Sari Saunders, Andy McKinnon from the BC Ministry of Natural Resource Operations, Audubon, Alaska, and TNC. Ken today will talk about the multiple dimensions of building sustainability in the coastal rainforest. Please welcome Ken Lertzman.
Hello, it's a pleasure to be here again. It's great to be here in sunny weather. The last time it was 3 feet of melting snow and driving horizontal freezing rain, and it was a very nice difference from that yesterday on the boat. I'm going to shift gears a little bit from a lot of what we've been talking about this morning. I'm an ecologist, so I'm moving out of my comfort zone a little bit. One of the bottom lines of my talk today is that as ecologists, if we only pay attention to ecology, we're sunk. And so I'm going to talk about things mostly other than ecology today. And I realized my title here is a little bit optimistic, so here's a slight modification to the title. I would say more we're struggling to navigate the social, cultural, and ecological dimensions and learning something along the way. So this is where I'm talking about. It is a big strip of coastline essentially between our southern border and our northern border with Washington in the south and Alaska in the north. It's a big place. It's about almost 1,000 kilometers in a straight line flight distance. And if you stretch out all the bends and wiggles, you get up someplace, if you unfractal it, someplace around 25,000 or so kilometers with many, many islands. It's a complex place. There are interesting east, west, and north-south environmental gradients. It is both culturally diverse as well as ecologically diverse, and relatively unpopulated compared to most other places in the world. It's been the site of intense conflicts around forest management for a long time. Essentially, my whole career has been framed by conflicts in the forests around logging practices, around protection, around how people will or won't make a living in the forests. We're today, in some ways, moving out of a kind of a long-term stalemate there, and there are a lot of interesting dimensions to how and why we're doing that. A bunch of the factors that impinge on that, first of all, are a history of Supreme Court decisions over the last 15 years or so that really changed the context for First Nations rights and title, and the degree to which both provincial and federal governments need to recognize the role of First Nations in coastal British Columbia. That has been in many ways transformational in what has been possible to do on the coast. In the context really following up from that, there have been a number of reconciliation agreements between the province of British Columbia and the First Nations. These are, you may have heard referred to as government-to-government negotiations, recognizing First Nations as governments negotiating with equal standing to the Government of Canada and the Government of British Columbia. The strategies of the environmental NGOs, especially market campaigns from the mid-90s through to the early 2000s, were very effective at bringing industrial partners to the table to talk. In fact, the industry tended to recognize the effectiveness of those campaigns before government did, and really were at the table as a meaningful partner before government was. Another factor that has played a big role, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later, is that looking desperately in the early to mid-90s, looking desperately for a way out of the mess that they were in, government kind of, as an act of desperation, actually started talking to the scientists and embodied a panel to make recommendations about how to change logging practices and develop conservation strategy. And that has made a big difference. I'll talk more about that as a kind of a focused case study. And as I said, the First Nations, the industry, and the NGOs initially led the way in the Great Bear Rainforest area in the central and north coast, bringing government to the table afterwards. Conservation financing has played a really big role. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Over the last few years, the withdrawal to some extent and the reorganization to some extent of the major forest industries on the coast, really in response to dismal forest products markets over the last few years, has played a very big role in changing the nature of the opportunities available to communities and First Nations in particular. This has been in some ways what can be considered a restructuring of the social contract in British Columbia between government and its management agencies as representing government and industry and the people. There's been a lot of very fundamental changes, which we won't really have time to go into today, that restructure essentially the nature of the commitment of government to look after or the ways in which it claims to try and look after the benefits that would accrue to local communities from the commitments to forest industry. Certification has played a big role. And finally, ecosystem-based management, what we're calling ecosystem-based management, has really been put forward as a model around which people could work together. I wouldn't say it's a solution, but it is a model for management that has allowed people to come to the table and talk who historically were antagonists. And so that's really what I'm going to focus on today, is sort of a bunch of ideas in relation to ecosystem-based management and the broader social and policy context in which it's embedded and what we've been able to try and achieve in that context. So today I'll start out with a little bit of coast-wide context, the central and north coast, what's become known as the Great Bear Rainforest, Haida Gwaii, and Clayoquot Sound in the south. I'll tell you a little bit about what ecosystem-based management and the things in which it's embedded look like today, what's actually happening, what this is starting to look like on the ground. I'll focus on some kind of 15-year implementation follow-up, some lessons from Clayoquot Sound, which was the first of these case studies to come under this kind of a management regime. And I'll finish up talking about some of the challenges that all this poses for communities and what I think are some of the key issues looking forward from here. What are the key priorities on our agenda? And I think you'll find that overall there are a lot of very strong and interesting parallels with what's going on in the Tongass here, ecologically, socially, economically, and so on, despite some fairly interesting and significant differences in policy and the governance context. So ecosystem-based management in BC, if you read the ecosystem-based management literature, at least in its origins, it's tend to focus almost exclusively on ecological kinds of issues. And certainly my biases was this is the management regime where we get to say what's going to happen, we the ecologists. This is about ecological integrity and so on. And that's where we started out, and I'll talk about the Clayoquot Science Panel, and that's really where we were grounded initially in the early 90s. It's evolved a long way since then, and so essentially all of the more recent agreements around EBM in British Columbia assert this dual set of goals, one of ecological integrity, about maintaining species and the ecological processes that support them, and on the other hand, supporting, enhancing human well-being or community well-being. And really we are supposed to be asserting pretty equally these two goals and moving ahead on both of them. And it's a fairly distinct way of looking at it, but there's some very important consequences to it. Having those two goals is really what allowed all of the different players to come to the table to talk about this. If it would have been this is just about ecology, just about conservation, we wouldn't be where we are today. I wanted to give you an example of what some of these reconciliation agreements look like. So this is the celebration for the signing of the reconciliation agreement in Haida Gwaii in 2009. The dimensions of this agreement are broad and I think transformative in a lot of ways for what's going on in Haida Gwaii. There is, in fact, today incredibly exciting stuff happening in Haida Gwaii in terms of the nature of the governance of natural resources. There is what's called the solutions table, which is housed in what used to be the Ministry of Forests office, but now houses the Haida Watchman, as well as the Ministry of Environment, as well as the Ministry of Forests. The solution table brings together different partners from the federal government, the provincial government, and the Council of the Haida Nation as equal partners in making decisions. And we just had, for the first time in the history of British Columbia, an annual allowable cut set not by the chief forester in Victoria, but set locally by the solutions table that recognizes and happens in the context of these local negotiations about what kind of forests, what kind of forest industry those communities want. This is just like 2 weeks ago. From a BC perspective, this is remarkably groundbreaking. So the dimensions of this agreement are shared decision-making, details about forestry, details about resource revenue sharing. This is largely between the Council of the Haida Nation and the province of British Columbia. Explicit criteria about carbon offset sharing, explicit issues around socioeconomic well-being, a lot of details on implementation, and a strategic land use agreement. There's a lot of really interesting, if you're interested in policy, if you're interested in governance, there's a lot of very interesting stuff happening there. In the context of all this kind of stuff, we're actually seeing meaningful change in the degree to which First Nations are actually engaged in the traditional resource industries, especially in forestry. So we've gone from essentially almost nothing in the 80s through a very large increase in involvement in the 2000s. Though this is still less than a tenth of the total harvest in the province, it's a much more substantial involvement. There's a lot of interesting things about this. One of them is that this is a really hard time to start getting involved in the forest industry in a serious way. The forest industry is changed, as Gordon was saying, is changing in very fundamental ways on the coast of British Columbia. There are a lot of drivers of this. Some of them are global markets, as well as global environmental change. Some of them are local in terms of demographics, in terms of harvesting costs, in terms of the nature of the workforce. There's a lot of changes in the nature of the top-down governance from the province of British Columbia. And while there are a lot of opportunities, there are a lot of traps. We can talk about what I mean by traps later if people are interested. And I think one of the real challenges for communities that hope to become involved in this now is trying to recognize really where are the opportunities and where are the traps. It's one thing for the local branch plant of a multinational company to declare bankruptcy and sell off their assets and leave. It's a different thing if it's a community forest or a company owned by a First Nation or a company owned by the local municipality. The consequences to the local people, to the province, are very different. So in that context, I'm going to talk about 3 places here. So the first is Haida Gwaii. The second is the coastal mainland, what we refer to as the North Coast and the Central Coast, which really was originally what was called the Great Bear Rainforest, though that's now being used to refer to Haida Gwaii as well. And Clayoquot Sound, roughly around 1 million hectares for Haida Gwaii, about 7 million total for the coastal mainland, and Clayoquot's a lot smaller at 350,000 hectares. Now, I thought it'd be useful to actually give you sort of the basic demography of these places, and I've tried to include some numbers from the Tongass here to put it in context. I'd like to thank the people who responded very quickly to my plea last week for numbers on the Tongass. I'm not sure these are correct better than 10 or 15%, but it should be close enough to give you some ballparks. So we're talking about a lot of area here. The Tongass at about, do you have a Tongass at about 6,800,000 hectares, about the same size as the coastal mainland. The dates we had of when EBM was brought in are 95 for Clayoquot, 2006, 2007 for the more northerly areas. If you do a calculation of the percent protected forest, this is just in essentially areas that are protected by statute, parks, wilderness areas in BC, areas that are essentially set aside outside the management process. We have a remarkable similarity in some ways, 33% in Clayoquot, 33% in the coastal mainland, 50% in Haida Gwaii, and something like 30% or a little more in the Tongass. In each case, we can add a substantial amount to that, reflecting reserved areas that are really decided on as part of the management process, riparian reserves, late cereal reserves, reserves in the managed landscape, which brings up the total protected area in the region as a whole to fairly substantial, assuming we're doing a good job on that additional 20 to 30%. If you look at residents in these areas, we have about 5,000 in Clayoquot, about 22,000 in the north and central coast, 3,800 in Haida Gwaii, and 72,000 in Tongass. My guess is a pretty big chunk of that is here in Juneau. The percent of indigenous population is about 35% in Clayoquot, 50% in the central coast and Haida Gwaii and north coast, and around 20% for the Tongass. And let's look at the AAC as annual allowable cut. For the BC cases, we've got before and after the bringing in ecosystem-based management. And for the Tongass, what I have here is just sort of the cut from a while back, 15, 20 years ago, and what the cut seems to be more recently. In all these cases, we see a very substantial decline from the pre-EBM cut to the post-EBM cut, anywhere from a third to two-thirds reduction in the cut area. And we would argue essentially that this reflects going from a regime of mining the accumulated environmental capital of past centuries to moving towards a cut that is actually more sustainable in the context of doing a good job of conservation and maintaining ecosystem processes. But there's some interesting complexities around that I'll come back to in a few minutes. A couple of the other interesting things to think about, I mentioned that conservation financing has played a really important role here. Again, without substantial input of conservation financing to allow this to happen, I don't think, in fact, I know we would never have come to the nature of the agreements that we did. There's a $60 million conservation fund and a $60 million economic development fund, both directed towards engaging First Nations on the central and north coast and Haida Gwaii. Some of the kinds of things that are happening with this, it's funding the Coastal Guardian Watchman Network, which is a network on the ground, on the water, of representatives from First Nations communities up and down the coast who are going out and doing what they're basically out there. It's a combination of a policing role, marine rescue role, environmental monitoring role, and is incredibly important both for those communities and for getting some of those activities happening, because the province isn't really doing that anymore. Another kind of really important initiative that's happening from this conservation financing is funding essentially in-house research and consulting groups in the First Nations communities that are enabling them to engage a lot more effectively with the resource management agencies, with industries, and with researchers like myself. This Healthic Integrated Resource Management Department is one of the groups that we're working most closely with, and is becoming a sort of a role model for a lot of other places on the coast for actually taking on and engaging with what has become an extraordinarily complicated planning process around forest management and conservation. This is sort of what some of that looks like. I'm not going to be going into any more details. Tomorrow we'll get to hear from George Hoberg in a little bit more detail about some of the interesting intricacies around all of this. But it is an incredibly complex process, and one of the challenges is finding ways to actually participate effectively in this for a lot of communities that are already really pushed to their capacity to deal with all the other things that they have on their plates. Another really important concept, it's really one of the underpinnings of the conservation planning process here, has to do with a recognition that we're trying to maintain watersheds, landscapes more generally, within some kind of a context that is defined by their range of natural variability. There's a lot of interesting issues with how you define the range of natural variability and what's natural and what's the time period and the spatial period that you would do that. And there's a lot of problems with how we've done that, which I'm not going to talk about today. But we've come up with numbers, largely in the absence of really good data. But you can imagine that if you average across time or across space, you'll get some sort of range of variability of these ecosystems, say over the past hundreds, perhaps thousands of years, in attributes such as the percent old forest. In fact, in my experience, most of our landscapes over the past hundreds to few thousands of years or across large areas of space are within 80 to 100% old forest most of the time in most of the places. So you can look at this green curve as something like that. And we've said that we want to take some sort of an average there as our kind of target range of natural variability, and then set some targets for the thresholds that we don't want to exceed for managed landscapes. So that if we have a 70% default target for landscape X, you don't want less than 70% of that landscape in old forest at any given time. Alternatively, we might set 50% of that as a default target, or 30% as a default target. We've also established what we call risk-managed targets. I think it's a bit of a misnomer. It's not really a risk-managed target, it's a high-risk target, saying if you go below 30% in that landscape, then you're in a region of high risk to biological diversity. Here's some examples. The only thing to really look here is to scan down those numbers and see that most of the default targets are kind of 70%, with a few of them at 100%, a few of them at 30%, and most of the risk-managed targets are around 30%. There's a lot of argument about the implementation of this. It's actually working from some kind of an idea about the range of natural variability is a really good idea. There's a lot of ecology that's gone into thinking about that. There's a lot of places in North America we're working on those kinds of ideas. The specific numbers have a lot of problems with them from a lot of different reasons, but they have become a working table where people can start actually working on those details. And there's a lot of interesting issues around that, which I think George is going to talk about tomorrow. Sorry, Roger. Okay. This is an image of, sort of a poster child image of 2011 logging. It isn't very similar to what I've seen, but there's logging that is happening now, coming out of the downturn in the economy over the last few years. Things are starting to happen. I think probably that will generate an upsurge in some of the conflicts that are happening as well. A lot of what the logging that's happening on the coast isn't as sort of neat and tidy as this. This is probably a little bit more typical and probably looks pretty familiar to people around here as well. There are a lot of issues with declaring what is acceptable waste and residue and what should be removed because it's so expensive to log there and the wood is worth so little unless it's cedar. A lot of stuff gets left behind, and in fact companies would largely rather pay fines for leaving stuff behind than pay for moving it off the ground. There's a lot of discussion of opportunities for biofuels, opportunities for carbon credits, and a lot of different trade-offs are being batted around in discussions of this right now. There's also some pretty interesting stuff happening in terms of really ramping up the quality of riparian protection. So this is a stream that is just outside the cut block on the bottom left that would have previously probably had a barely minimal non-functional riparian buffer around it, and now is actually pretty substantially protected by a big chunk of forest. it's an interesting mix of kind of same old kinds of problems and some very interesting new stuff. Okay, I'm going to shift gears a little bit. The Clayoquot case is an interesting one to talk about because since it really started 15 years ago, we can actually ask, so what does some of this look like as it plays out over time, as opposed to just, okay, we're in the middle of it and then it's confusing and complicated and exciting all at the same time, but we don't really have any data. Clayoquot Sound is a mix of outer coast, protected inner waters, outer coastal islands, and big watersheds kind of bumped up on the Vancouver Island mainland where most of the commercial forest is. It's well known for unlogged forests, but it's actually a complex mosaic of pretty heavily logged areas outlined here and small unlogged watersheds that provide some of the really significant conservation opportunities there. It is the homeland of the Nuu-chah-nulth people, and they have played a really big role in everything that's happened there. It had been the site of controversy from the early 80s. In 1993, the provincial government brought in a land use decision that protected a chunk more of the forest than had been protected, declared a lot of scenic corridors, did a bunch of things, and essentially declared everything remaining to be managed under general integrated resource management. That's the green areas in this map, which is still most of it. That generated a huge amount of protest, the largest single acts of disobedience in the history of Canada, the largest number of arrests in the history of Canada, and that created a lot of problems for them. It was essentially a massive rejection of what they had seen as the solution to land use conflicts in Clayoquot Sound. Their out from that was to say we'll have a scientific panel, the Clayoquot Scientific Panel for Sustainable Forest Practices. And both government and industry said before the panel had met, and we'll do what they say. So in my experience, it's almost the only case I can think of where a government has said that they would do, essentially giving the scientists policy making ability, not just policy advisory capability, and saying they would follow the recommendations before they knew what the recommendations were. There were 19 panel members, which included 4 Nuu-chah-nulth elders. I was a part of this, and we were charged with using a combination of Western science and local and traditional knowledge to design new standards for forest management. And we recognize that Western science and traditional knowledge are complementary and can be used together in this process. And in fact, all the recommendations were eventually accepted by the provincial government. We had a number of major conclusions. There's lots of interesting details I'm not going to go into, but essentially we said that existing policies, guidelines, and practices were inadequate to sustain the resources, ecosystems, and people of Clayoquot Sound. And the way forward was ecosystem-based management, and that there was, in fact, a Nuu-chah-nulth concept which was mapped really well onto what the ecologists understood as ecosystem-based management called Hishakisawak, which essentially means everything is one or everything is connected. And so what we were doing was really focusing on those ecological connections and the connections of people in that context. The other major conclusions had to do with this idea of integrating the Nuu-chah-nulth into forest management much more fundamentally than they ever had been before, and integrating traditional knowledge. So we recognized that integrating these different sources of knowledge was essential for us to be able to go forward with EBM there. And there were a large number of recommendations about how to transform the way that the Nuu-chah-nulth people were connected to what was being done in their forests. One of the really important things that we recommended was to assert the central role of planning. Now, at this point, planning was completely marginalized in the forestry system in BC. Almost the only job that you could get in forestry that didn't require that you be a registered professional forester was to be a planner. And so a lot of my students who weren't foresters got jobs in planning because of that. We said, no, planning is actually really, logging, forestry is not just about planning logging, forestry is about everything. And so we developed a hierarchical planning process starting with regional protected areas networks and going down to operational planning. We had a big focus on watershed scale planning and asserted that you need to establish your ecosystem objectives first, not start out with an allowable cut and then try and find it. And that the harvestable area and the allowable cut really are outputs of the planning process rather than the inputs of the planning process. This may sound completely obvious to you, but it was incredibly radical for BC at the time. And in fact, Clayoquot is still the only place in the province where it works that way. And we asserted a fairly stringent rate of cut limitation on a watershed basis. Most of the attention got paid to the fact that we essentially eliminated traditional clear cutting as a silvicultural system and asserted a partial cutting system that was based on our understanding of just natural disturbance and recovery processes. This is eventually spread, this defined a new silvicultural system for British Columbia and has spread throughout the coast and parts of the interior, called variable retention. Okay, what I'd like to do is now talk a little bit about, so what have we learned 15 years later? So that was essentially all the exciting stuff from 1995. How has it played out? And I'd like to acknowledge EcoTrust Canada. I know there's folks from EcoTrust US here, put together a symposium last year to provide a context for this 15-year follow-up discussion. Well, one of the things that's happened is the harvest has dropped dramatically. The allowable cut and the actual harvest have dropped dramatically. First, in the context of the land use plan that the province brought in, dropped from about 900,000 hectares, down, or cubic meters rather, down to about 600,000 cubic meters. And then again, in the science panel implementation, there was another big drop as we developed these logging plans that really arose from this watershed planning process. One of the really interesting things here is that gap between the red line and the white line that basically since 1990, first largely because of the protests and then after that because of the complexities of implementing all these changes, the actual cut has been well below what would have been allowed on a statutory basis. And this is interesting. Okay, I'm going to speed up for the last couple of minutes here. This has been interesting for a lot of reasons that largely don't really have much to do with the ecology or the engineering or the forestry part of the problem here. In doing this review, we came up with a bunch of things that worked really well and a bunch of things that didn't. Things that worked really well, the watershed plans, focusing more on ecosystem processes, having the AAC as an output of planning, the harvesting systems, the reduced rate of cut, actually having all of the forestry in Clayoquot Sound being through a Nuu-chah-nulth-owned company, engagement of First Nations in general in the management process, the conservation economy largely through tourism in the non-native communities, establishment of a biosphere reserve, protection of cultural features, better inventory, and so on. A lot of things didn't work really well. No monitoring, no adaptive management. So we don't know if the reserves and the retention are going to be sufficient to do what they were supposed to. The socioeconomic consequences of the reduced AAC have been really, really hard. There has been little benefit to First Nations communities despite owning the company that's doing the logging. And they essentially say they're basically in the same place they were in 1993, no change. The undeveloped watersheds remain an issue. It's unresolved. There's a lot of problems around governance there between the province and the First Nations and the NGOs. There's a lot of issues around capacity. And so the real question is, where are we then? What's going to happen here? Can we learn lessons from Clayoquot to take forward to the other areas in the province where EBM is being sort of held out as what's going to get us out of this? And what I'm going to do, I've got my stop now message, so I'm going to skip through to the last slide here.
Okay, we should go reverse. Try going backwards.
No, actually, I'm just about there. So, and then
If you click on it, then you push F5. It didn't work. What number is it?
okay, yeah, keep going. Keep going more. This one. Okay, so where we end up then is really if we're thinking about this from the perspective of the communities, where are the opportunities and where are the traps? There's a huge amount of complexity to this system, and people like me, people like a lot of us here in the research community really need to be asking ourselves, how best can we support this? So what are the take-home messages then? This is a time of huge change in the forest industry and for forest-based communities. And there's been a lot of successes associated with EBM, but a lot of challenges and details to be worked out as well. We need to think about integration of our management strategies across ecosystems and scales, integrating the marine, the freshwater, and the terrestrial systems. Communities can't expect to play the same old games and win. That is, they can't just think about taking over the kind of role that the major forest industries had, because it doesn't work anymore. That's why the majors are leaving. We need to get past the volume logged as an indicator of well-being, which is still being talked about as the kind of the primary measure of community well-being. We need something which is as game-changing in the arena of community economic sustainability as EBM is in the context of just forest management practice. And we need a forest management system which is reframed in its goals and objectives, not just its methods. We've done the engineering, but we need to get back to kind of what are we actually trying to achieve here. And there's a critical need for communities to be strategic about what they want from forest management, not just reactive to opportunities, because a lot of the opportunities are mutually exclusive and a lot of them aren't going to work. And finally, there's a huge role for partnerships here in the realm of capacity building. Thank you.
Hey folks, I have two main points as we go into break. The first is a big thank you to all 5 of our great speakers for this morning. The second is that we have lunch, and that is in Ballroom 2, where it's being served. You'll go through as a buffet style to get your lunch. We would like you to come back and filter back into here, and after everybody's settled down, after a little while, Mayor Botello and Terry Chapin will be coming up to speak for a few moments. Enjoy your lunch. We'll see you back here shortly.